I'm Dr. Toby DeLong Hamilton, and I'll be interviewing Dr. Catherine Crace from Long Island University today about mandated reporting in child welfare. Hi, Catherine. How are you today?
I'm doing very well. Thanks for having me, Toby.
Thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate your time. So, would you mind giving us a little bit about your background?
Sure. When I was in a dual degree program, graduate program in law and social work, I became interested in child welfare work. And when I graduated with my master's in social work and then my law degree, I went into child welfare practice as both an attorney and a social worker. So I represented as a lawyer children in Manhattan Family Court here in New York City. And as a social worker, I ran parent education programs in and around New York City for a number of years. During that time, I got very interested in how families became the subject of child protective cases. And I learned about a phenomenon which I had been introduced to in social work called mandated reporting. When certain professionals or certain adults in a given jurisdiction, a given state, are required by law to make reports of suspected child maltreatment directly to a government agency, usually Child Protective Services. I then started working for Fordham University's Interdisciplinary Center for Family and Child Advocacy a few years after I graduated from law school. And it was through that experience at Fordham that I became involved with a group of parents who had been involved in the child welfare system. And one of the main concerns they had with the child welfare system was with reports that were being made by the community, often of concerned citizens, but that they felt were not proper reports. So I started working closely with these parents to identify their concerns about what reports were coming into the system that they thought shouldn't. And then at the same time, I started training mandated reporters, mostly social workers, but I also train teachers and social service providers and child care workers about their legal obligations here in New York State. I've also done training in New Jersey, and I've done national online training so that professionals understand what is child abuse and neglect, as well as how and where they're supposed to report. So I've been doing work in and around child welfare for about the past 12 to 13 years.
Great. Thank you so much. Can you just tell our listeners what mandated reporting is and why it's so
Sure.
important?
And I'd love to give a little historical context to it because we've been in a society where there's been Child Protective Services as long as we've been alive. But Child Protective Services are actually a pretty new phenomenon in the scheme of our country. So the government only got involved in protecting children from abuse and neglect at the hands of their parents back in the 1950s and 1960s. And it was at that time that specifically doctors were noticing injuries, patterns of injuries of broken bones in children that were unexplained by accident. And through the use of x-rays, they determined that there was a pattern of behavior that must have been the parent's responsibility that was causing these fractures in young children. And so they determined that the medical community called upon the government to respond to what they saw as battered child syndrome, which was really the first acknowledgement that children were being abused and neglected in their households, even if the parents weren't poor or alcoholics. And so it really created this national attention to concerns about child protection and the need for the government to get involved. So a series of laws got passed, first in the 1960s at the state level of government, and then in 1974 at the federal level of government. CAPTA, or the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act, was passed by Congress and signed into law by the president. And what CAPTA did is it kind of solidified a general system of child protective services across the country. It came up with basic definitions for what child physical abuse was, what child neglect was, what child sexual abuse should be defined as. And so all states who wanted to receive federal assistance, financial assistance, towards the development of their child protective services. So if you wanted money from the federal government to help run your child protective services, you needed to follow the guidelines set forth by the federal government in terms of these definitions and some other policies. And one of these other policies that CAPTA required states to institute was a policy that would mandate certain groups of professionals to make reports to Child Protective Services if they were suspicious of a particular situation, if they had concerns that a child was being physically abused, neglected, or sexually abused. And at that time, back in 1974, the list of mandated reporters was pretty small. The list generally included doctors, nurses, and other medical personnel, and then very quickly added to that list were teachers and other school personnel. And the federal government didn't really mandate that the states require anybody more than that to report. But at this point, across all 50 states, there's different lists of who are mandated reporters. So, for instance, I live in a state, New York State, where there's about 35 different professional titles that are mandated reporters, from medical personnel, educational personnel, law enforcement officials, social workers, chiropractors, animal protection specialists, dental hygienists, etc. But then there are a number of states that have a law that all adults, anybody 18 years of age or older, are mandated reporters. And so it really depends on what state you are, whether or not you're a mandated reporter. But if you are a mandated reporter in your given state, the expectations are pretty much the same, that the law requires you to make a report to Child Protective Services or another government entity if you reasonably believe that a child may be at risk of child abuse or neglect, whether the child abuse and neglect has occurred or whether you believe it might have the potential to occur imminently sometime in the near future. So mandated reporters in all 50 states include social workers. So for those of us who are teaching social workers, it's important for us to tell social workers that you're a mandated reporter. But there are some other things that people need to be aware of. The first thing is to make sure you know who are mandated reporters in your state, because you may be in a state where everybody's a mandated reporter if you're 18 or over. And if you live in those states, then if you're an adult, you're a mandated reporter even if you have concerns about your neighbor or a family member. In the state that I live in, here in New York, if I have concerns about a family member or a neighbor, I am not legally obligated to make that report if I don't gain those suspicions through my professional practice. So it's very important for every person, adult or professional, to understand what the law is about who's a mandated reporter in their state. Because if you are a mandated reporter and you fail to make a report when you're supposed to, the law in your state can punish you for failing to make that report. And there could be civil or criminal action against you if you don't make a report.
Thank you so much for that background. Would there be any concern on the part of a mandated reporter if they made the report and then a parent sued them?
So if it's unfounded or unsubstantiated?
Right.
Okay. Yes. So one of the benefits of the CAPTA legislation is that it made sure to safeguard protections for mandated reporters. Federal law and state law encourages mandated reporters to make reports by providing them with immunity if they make a report and it's unfounded or unsubstantiated. So, for instance, actually in the supermajority of cases, almost 70% of all cases that are reported on a national level are unsubstantiated or unfounded after investigation, which means a report is made, CPS goes out to do an investigation, and they just don't find enough evidence of abuse or neglect to move forward on the case. And so the vast majority of cases are in the United States that get reported are in that category of unfounded or unsubstantiated. And in those cases, reporters often worry that, well, if I was wrong, if I made a report and I was wrong, am I going to get sued, or is somebody going to get mad at me, or is there something that's going to happen to me if I made a report that's unfounded? And so the law in all 50 states protects that reporter from any legal action by providing immunity, which means specifically that the person, the reporter, whether they're a mandated reporter or not, if you make a report in good faith, then you cannot successfully be sued. There's no criminal action against you, and there's laws to protect you against retaliation as well. So what good faith means is that you need to have thought that the information you were providing was accurate, that you were not malicious, you're not lying, that you, the reporter, made a report based on information that you believe to be true. So it could be that the person you talked to might have given you bad information, but that's not your responsibility as a mandated reporter to investigate what you're being told, just to report your suspicions. So the law protects the reporter by providing them with immunity. So the law is there to protect the mandated reporter, although I'm honest in all my trainings, it's not a comfortable feeling to think that you made a report and you were wrong. But one of the things that I like to tell people when I do a training is just because a report was unsubstantiated or unfounded, number one, doesn't mean that abuse or neglect wasn't happening. It just means that CPS, Child Protective Services, couldn't find enough evidence. They might not have had access to the same people that you did, or might not have gotten the same answers or same information. So it's very possible that abuse or neglect was occurring, but there's just not enough evidence. But even if a report is unsubstantiated, the fact is when CPS intervenes with the family, they can help the family, whether the report is unfounded or not. So even an unfounded report can be an opportunity for a family to get services or interventions that they wouldn't otherwise have gotten. So I don't want any reporter to think that an unfounded report is a failure on their part, but in fact it could actually be a really important tool for helping a family.
That's really good information for our students to hear. Thank you so much. How would one go about finding out if they are a mandated reporter in their state?
Okay. So the easiest way, and thank goodness for technology, is just to Google it. So that's what I always tell people is if you have access to the internet, then all you have to do is Google mandated reporter and your state. Generally, each state has a website that lists who's a mandated reporter in their state, so that's one easy way to do it. There's also an organization, a governmental organization, through the Department of Health and Human Services, and through the Office of, the Administration for Children and Families, but it's childwelfare.gov is a great website, and they actually have a very handy report that's updated on an almost annual basis about mandated reporting, and they have a list of mandated reporters by state. So because the childwelfare.gov report's only published every so often, it may not always indicate the most up-to-date information. So that's why I always encourage people to simply Google your state and and mandated reporter, and you will usually get a pretty quick link to a government agency in your state that will let you know. And if you can't find yourself on that list, but you still have questions, every state has a hotline where reports of child abuse and neglect can be made. And those hotlines are also available to ask questions. So you can feel free as a mandated reporter or just a regular citizen to call that hotline. They're open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and just ask them. You can call them about a case that you're not sure if you should call in, and they're there to consult with you and help you answer those questions.
Thank you so much. You've mentioned the trainings that you've completed in the past and presentations you've made with social workers and parents, and I know you've done a lot of research in this area as well. You recently had 2 articles published on mandated reporting. Can you tell us a little bit about your research and what you found?
Sure. So my research interests in mandated reporting came out of my work that I did at Fordham's Interdisciplinary Center here in New York City with a number of families. And back at the time of my doctoral studies, there was a phenomenon that the Child Protective Services community was really concerned about, and it was racial disproportionality in reporting of child abuse and neglect and just child welfare involvement in general. So disproportionality, racial disproportionality means that in this particular instance in child welfare, children of color, African American children, Latino children, Native American children, tend to be overrepresented in child welfare populations. So as compared to their population proportion, the portion of that group in the population, there are more African American children, Latino children, and Native American children who are reported to child welfare, who are subjects of substantiated cases, as well as placed in foster care, et cetera. So there was great concern in the community about racial disproportionality and how to address it. So I first started doing research on the area of racial disproportionality in child welfare reporting, specifically by mandated reporters. So my first study was on educational personnel here in New York City and across New York State, and whether teachers and other educational personnel were responsible for some of this over-reporting or disproportionate reporting of African American children in New York State, which was an issue that the state was concerned about. And so what I found through my research is that racial disproportionality is, while the numbers on state levels and national levels are readily available and discussed, what I found by doing a targeted analysis at the county level is that disproportionality differs across localities. And so while in certain jurisdictions, racial disproportionality is found at very high rates, where, for instance, in a particular county here in New York State, African American children were almost 3 times more likely to be reported by teachers to Child Protective Services than white children, for instance. In other counties, there was no statistical difference in the proportion of children who were reported by race. So I was able to kind of shine a light on this concern that many Child Protective Services officials had about racial disproportionality and encourage them to do a more local analysis so that they could really target areas to really understand what was happening to make the racial disproportionality an issue in that area. And they can provide community-level responses to racial disproportionality. So I've taken that research and I've expanded it to other reporters, and I've looked at various states. And so through my research, I hope I've helped child welfare professionals, specifically through the government, to get a better understanding of where racially disproportionate reports are coming from. And they tend to come from schools and law enforcement. And so now those child protective agencies can look into why reports are coming from those particular groups in a racially disproportionate way. So besides racial disproportionality, I just published an article with you on universal mandated reporting, and it's another issue that I think is really important to understand. As I mentioned before, there are states where there's a delineated list of mandated reporters that includes medical personnel, educational personnel, social service workers, social workers, et cetera. But in other states, everybody who's an adult is a mandated reporter. And I had communications a number of years ago with officials in New Jersey, that's a state right next door to me here in New York. And they were concerned because they have a very high rate of unsubstantiated reports. I mentioned nationally that figures hovers in around the 2/3, like 60 to 70% of reports. But in New Jersey, they had a particularly distressing child fatality case, and as a result, they had a large spike in child abuse reports a number of years ago, and they were seeing unsubstantiated cases taking up about 90% of their caseload. So they were really concerned about their the high rate of report, and they happen to be one of these universal mandated reporter states. So everybody in New Jersey, if you're an adult, are required to make reports. And but if you cross the border into New York, you have to be on this list. So New Jersey really was interested in getting an idea of what their rate of report was compared to other states, and if there were differences between states with mandated reporting, with universal mandated reporting, or a delineated list. So you and I got to analyze national data from a few years ago to see if there were actual differences between universal mandated reporter states and states with delineated lists. And I think there weren't a lot of significant differences between states. We had a few findings that were significant, but what was most interesting is states often think that moving to universal mandated reporting is going to get them more reports. They're afraid that without universal mandated reporting, they may be missing cases. And what our research showed is that there's really no difference in general in terms of the reports that are coming in between states with universal mandated reporting laws and a delineated list, suggesting that we might not need to make a large effort towards universal mandated reporting, and really need to think longer and harder about how states devise their reporting requirements to encourage better reporting. And actually, the one interesting finding, which gets kind of technical, is about educational personnel. So in states where there was universal mandated reporting, teachers' reports made up less of a proportion of reports. Teachers are often the greatest source of reports in a state. But in states with universal mandated reporting, they were responsible for a lower proportion, suggesting that there were reports coming from other reporters as well. But I think it's really important to do research on reports. There's not a lot of people out there doing statistical analysis at the stage of reporting, and I think it's a really important public health issue, actually, to make sure that we know what's happening at the reporting level in our communities.
Thank you so much. This podcast is geared towards our students here at the University of Utah. So are there any tips or last pieces of information that would be important for our students to know about mandated reporting?
Well, Utah is a universal mandated reporting state, right?
Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, it is.
Yeah. So the big thing to know about mandated reporting in general, and let's talk about this for social workers, because I think that's super important, because no matter where you are in the United States as a social worker in your professional role, you're a mandated reporter. And when I focus my training on social workers, what I also remind people is that while, yes, you have this legal obligation to make a report, you also have this ethical obligation to your client. And for some professionals out there who are mandated reporters, they don't have the same ethical obligation to their clients. So there might not be the same concerns about client confidentiality that we as social workers have to pay particular attention to. Other professionals making reports don't have ethical obligations to ensure social justice, don't have ethical obligations for informed consent, et cetera. So we're really special as mandated reporters, and so we need to be conscious when we're involving our clients in the child welfare system that just because we're the ones making a report doesn't mean that we give up our role as social worker. So if we are making a report to Child Protective Services for our client, that doesn't mean that we have to stand back and no longer advocate for our client. So we could fill our legal obligation to make a report, but still continue to serve our client by advocating for them. So we can work with CPS on behalf of our client to help our client improve communication with CPS during an investigation or any resulting action. We can ensure that CPS is doing their job and providing all the services that they can to our client. But we as social workers can also help our client deal with what other either deficiencies in their parenting practices or challenges that they're facing, emotional, psychological, so that they mitigate the risk of abuse and neglect to their kids. So social workers are, I think, the most important mandated reporter out there, because we're not just simply picking up the phone and making a report. We're making reports about people that our clients who we have other obligations to serve. So I think it's really important for us to remember that there's a role to play before a report for social workers, there's a role to play while making a report, and there's a role to play after a report is made. So a social worker's work is never done, but that's what makes us as important as of a professional as we are in the community. One thing I definitely want to highlight, because I kind of brought it up by talking about advocating for clients after making a report, I often get the question about whether you have to tell your client that you made a report about them. And so I'd just like to clarify that there's, in most states, you can't give an anonymous report when you're a social worker. Some states you can, some states you can't. But there's no law that says that you can't tell your client that you made a report about them. So I'm not suggesting that everybody, especially social workers, should tell their clients when they make a report, but that each social worker has the professional discretion to decide whether they want to talk to their client before they make the report or tell them after the report that they have to make a report. Through the informed consent process, whenever you're contracting with a client, you should make it clear that you are a mandated reporter and that anything they say that makes you suspicious of child abuse or neglect, you're going to have to make a report. So the client shouldn't be surprised if you have to make a report about them, because they should have an understanding of your legal obligation to do so. But if you, as a social worker or as any other type of reporter, do not feel comfortable telling the client that you made a report about them, whether you feel that it jeopardizes your safety, you feel retaliation might be possible, or that you are concerned about the impact of disclosing the report might negatively impact your working relationship with the client. It's really up to you as a social worker to make that determination whether or not you want the client to know you made the report. I do encourage people to think about this responsibility and do so with the respect that that your clients deserve.
Thank you so much. I think that's a really important tip for students to keep in mind as they go out into the field. Well, we so appreciate your time today and want to thank you very, very much for giving us this informative information about mandated reporting.
My pleasure.
Thank you
for having me.
Thank you so much.